maybe about 10 years ago, there was a sort of feminist reconsideration of Tracy. And people are saying, wait, why does everyone hate this character?
Tom Perrotta joins us to discuss the return of a famous protagonist in his new novel, Tracy Flick Can't Win.
Eugenics is basically social Darwinism. The idea was to have people who are healthy and smart, and especially white, have more children.
Anne Leary talks about her new novel, The Foundling, and the riveting real-life stories that inspired it. Plus, Alexandra Alter has news from the literary world, and my colleagues Greg Cowles and Liz Harris talk about what they've been reading. This is the Book Review Podcast. It's June 10th. I'm John Williams. Tom Perrotta is here. You know his work from page and screen. He's the author of many acclaimed novels, including Little Children, which he adapted into an Oscar-nominated screenplay, The Leftovers, which later became a series for HBO, and Election, which was turned into a movie starring a very memorable Reese Witherspoon as its lead character, Tracy Flick. Tracy is back now in Perrotta's new novel, Tracy Flick Can't Win, and he joins me now to talk about it. Hi, Tom. Thanks for being here.
Oh, hi, John. It's my pleasure.
So I guess first let's situate readers. Remind us where Tracy was at the end of Election, and then where is she when we pick her up in the new book?
Yes, at the end of Election, Tracy has been elected president rightfully. There's a teacher who tried to cheat and steal the election from her, but his fraud was exposed and Tracy got her rightful place and she leaves for college. But I think her self-confidence has been damaged a bit. She's trying to deny that, and she's going off to Georgetown, planning to take over the world in some sense. She has real ambitions for herself in a political sense. So we see a girl who looks to be on an upward trajectory to political success. And the movie Election shows that even a little more strongly, I think. But this new book, Tracy Flick Can't Win, picks up, and Tracy's in her mid-40s, and she's a single mom. And I think readers who expected really great things from Tracy because of her ambition and her competence will be a little surprised by the fact that her life seems more ordinary and her career less high-powered than they might have expected.
What is her career now? She's back at the same school, is she not?
It's not the same school, but it's in the same part of suburban New Jersey, just in another small town. And she's the assistant principal. And when the book begins, her boss, the principal, is retiring, and Tracy sees an opportunity for advancement. And so once again, she's sort of a candidate running for higher office.
How hard is it for her to make that decision to leave that trajectory and go take care of her mother? I know that their relationship was close when she was growing up.
That is indeed what knocks Tracy off this path to a political career. Her mom comes down with MS and needs a lot of help. And Tracy was raised by a single mom and had a really tight, exclusive relationship. She said it was really hard to tell where my mother left off and I began. And Tracy, like a lot of women, finds that she needs to be a caretaker and that those caretaking responsibilities make it hard for her to pursue her career with the kind of single-minded focus that she would like. She says she doesn't regret it, but it's clear that she feels like she made a choice that took something away from her.
How old is she now, and does she have a family of her own?
She's 43 years old, and she has a child who is 11 years old. The father is actually a married man who lives nearby, and they split custody. Tracy slept with this man who's an older professor during a period when he was separated from his wife, but then he got back together with his wife. So they have a very interesting, modern half-custody split where Tracy's sort of almost like a member of an extended family. Like everybody's fine with this shared custody setup.
So now a lot of time has passed. How is Tracy the same, and how has she changed in some of the most fundamental ways in your eyes?
I think she's changed in the way that middle age changes most people. When she's young, she is somebody who senses huge potential. Her ambition, she says flat out, was to be the first woman president of the United States. And so, that can sound a little bit delusional, but I actually think that delusion is crucial for anybody who wants to have a political career. In the same way, the delusion that I can write a novel is, the first step to writing a novel. Confidence is often willed, but Tracy has that confidence and she has that will as a young person. And as we say, circumstances turn out differently for her. And I think, like a lot of middle-aged people, she's looking back saying, did I fail or did I do the best I could? And she's trying to figure out how she should feel about a life and if she's disappointed. But the other big change, I think, and this is where the book actually begins, is that people who have read Election will know that Tracy had a sexual relationship with a high school teacher. And in the book Election and the movie Election, she doesn't seem to have a lot of regrets about that and doesn't see herself as a victim. She really believes in her own agency and her own power. And it's just something that happened to her. She's not even all that concerned about it. But when Tracy Flick Can't Win starts, it's right in the middle of the Me Too reckoning. And she's reading a lot of stories in the paper about women who were taken advantage of by bosses and mentors and teachers. And she's starting to think about, whether her own take on this story of what happened in high school is the correct one. And she's starting to be, as the colloquial phrase would have it, she's being triggered by the Me Too moment into rethinking her life. And then she starts vying for this job, and that's bringing back memories of the presidency of her high school being taken away from her. And she's starting to realize that maybe there's a kind of more systemic set of forces arrayed against her that make it impossible for her to win.
You mentioned that the book starts with her considering the Me Too moment and her own experience in the light of that. I hate to make either of us feel our age, but it's been 24, 25 years since the book and the movie came out. And so is some of your inspiration for writing this and returning to Tracy now because of your own reconsideration of all those things in that light, or was there a larger desire to return to her story at some point?
I think we've all had to do a lot of reconsidering, and men more than women probably, but some of that is wondering if we were right about our interpretation of events when we were younger. But others is just understanding how much it matters what cultural lens we're looking at the past through. So, for instance, when Election, the movie, first came out, Tracy was seen as a villain. It was very interesting for me. She's kind of Machiavellian. There's a sense that she's ruthless. She'll do anything to get ahead. She's a 16-year-old high school girl, and people were treating her as this scary Lady Macbeth type villain. And what happened, and was really interesting for me as a writer, was that maybe about 10 years ago, there was a sort of feminist reconsideration of Tracy. And people are saying, wait, why does everyone hate this character? She's a girl who is manipulated and abused by one teacher, and then this other teacher conspires to steal an election from her, and yet somehow she is seen as the villain. And it was very striking to me because I think both interpretations are available in the book, because Election was told through multiple points of view. One was Mr. M, the teacher, and one was Tracy. And it was really just a question of which view the reader feels drawn to and feels is correct. So people who identified with Mr. M thought Tracy was a villain. That was crucial to Mr. M's explanation of why he would stoop so low as to tamper with a high school election. It's to stop Tracy because she needs to be stopped. And a lot of people found themselves willing to identify with that idea. But I think if you put Tracy at the center, you come up with a different sense. So I will say that Tracy herself was adamant that she was not a victim, that she was very invested in this idea that she had agency, that she was able to make choices in her life, that nobody was making her do anything she didn't want to do. That was an important narrative for her. She found it empowering at that point in her life. And it's only later that she starts to doubt that, because the culture is providing this different lens. And, she's working as an assistant principal. She would never tolerate a teacher doing to a student what her teacher had done to her.
Is it fair to say that in the first book, you wanted Tracy obviously to be complicated and that there were things about her that you knew would annoy people, but that you didn't consider her not just not a villain, but, a primary antagonist in the book?
You get Tracy introduced by Mr. M, and he says, here's this girl and she's a problem and she needs to be stopped. And then you get to know Tracy and you get a complicated vision. She lives alone with a single mother. She feels like she has to work really hard to get everything. She's trying to get a scholarship to college because her mother can't really afford it. And you see her like you see a lot of stressed out kids trying to get into good colleges in America. She is hyper-focused, she's stressed out, she's deeply ambitious. And it was also a commentary, I think, on the ways in which ambitious women are judged differently. There's this cultural expectation that women need to be likable, even ambitious women who are going to work in politics, and even women who are trying to compete for the top position in competitive fields. Men don't seem to be held to the same standard. Nobody thinks Mitch McConnell needs to be likable. Luckily for Mitch.
Yeah, I'll leave that there. So I get the sense that you admire the movie, and obviously it has a lot of fans. But that said, do you think that in terms of that conversation, and there is sort of, I would call it almost a department, a sub-department of our cultural conversation, Tracy Flick analysis, did that movie make her less sympathetic than the novel did? And does that contribute to some of this feeling about her?
That could be. I think most people, when they think about Tracy Flick, I say this in all sad modesty, they're thinking about Tracy in the movie. Election as a book didn't make a huge splash, and Reese Witherspoon's performance was so powerful that I think the debate is really around Tracy in the film, and maybe to some degree me writing this book was an attempt to reclaim my own version of Tracy. But yes, I think the movie is a wonderful movie. It is maybe more satirical and sharp-edged than the book, and I think that worked really well on the screen. But I think even the movie gives you moments when you see Tracy as a real person and understand that there's a sadness that's driving her and a vulnerability that she is trying very desperately to conceal because it doesn't seem useful to her in terms of what her goals are in the world.
How was it meeting her again, as it were? I mean, when you sit down to write a character that you haven't written about in a while, how does it compare to the experience of meeting someone in life who you haven't seen in a long time? Is it pick right up where you left off? Is there a sense of slowly trying to get to know her better? Is it like riding a bike? How did that feel to you?
It was fine. I felt like she was right there, though I will say that it was hard for me to remember how I had conceived of Tracy when she's just belonged to me, when she was just made of words that I had written, because Reese Witherspoon's performance was so powerful that I found myself imagining the adult Tracy as a kind of middle-aged version of Reese Witherspoon. And I could hear that clipped way of speaking that Reese Witherspoon used in playing Tracy. But I did find that once I realized that she was still, in a sense, in high school, still vying for the next step on the ladder, she was pretty, I wouldn't say easy, but I never doubted her actions or her thoughts, So it wasn't an easy book to write. I wouldn't say that, but I felt it was not a problem to summon the adult Tracy into the book.
Did you try to combat that Witherspoonian influence at all? Or is there a sense in which you're comfortable with the idea that it might be shaded by that and that Tracy evolves over time as this combined cultural person?
I think what was interesting about it is that Reese Witherspoon's Tracy Flick is vibrating with energy and drive. And the Tracy of Tracy Flick Can't Win has a kind of a middle-aged heaviness about her. She feels a little stuck in her life, and she's much more, I think, introspective. So I think there are these new elements in the character that just involve that personality that existed in the past, confronting a set of circumstances that feel a little hopeless to her, or certainly disappointing. So I think that was what was countering what you call the Witherspoonian influence. Reese Witherspoon herself is almost like, if Tracy's wildest dreams came true, she would be a figure like Reese Witherspoon, who seems to have succeeded really wildly in all of her endeavors. Tracy herself had those sorts of dreams and just has never figured out how to make them real.
Let's talk briefly about another character, because actually both Election and this novel are much more polyphonic books than you would know from the cultural discourse about Tracy. Talk a little bit about Vito Falcone and the role that he plays in this story.
He plays a crucial role in this story. Vito is a former professional football player who went to the high school where Tracy now teaches. And the action of this novel is that Tracy is on a committee that is charged with choosing people to honor in a new Hall of Fame. And the first person everyone wants to honor is this guy, Vito Falcone. He was a star football player back in high school. He was great in college, and he played 3 seasons in the pros before a knee injury ended his career. So he had kind of an undistinguished pro career. Now he's a high school football coach, but he's beginning to suffer some cognitive problems that he's pretty sure are related to brain trauma from concussions that he got while playing football. And so he's in recovery. His family's fallen apart. He feels like he's losing his grip a little bit on his memory, on his ability to just do pretty ordinary things. And he's scared. And he's also on that step in recovery where he's apologizing to people he's wronged. And there are a lot of people that Vito has wronged. And I actually began the book with that idea that there was going to be a football player with brain trauma who goes back to his hometown to be honored and keeps finding himself confronted by people in the past that he had mistreated. Because it felt like such a really interesting metaphor for the state of masculinity in our culture right now, that certain football players are still honored in our culture, but I think we also see, boy, that takes a toll on them. And there's a sense that these guys who had seemed like the embodiment of a certain kind of physical and cultural power are also vulnerable and damaged and even figures to be pitied. And I thought that was a really interesting place to start. And I think Vito almost summoned Tracy, because the high school Vito was the kind of guy who just drove Tracy crazy.
Oh, that's interesting. So you're saying that the idea of Vito came pre-election sequel idea.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was writing this book about Vito, and I kept wanting to write it the way that I had written Election, in these chapters with multiple narrators, kind of oral history style, as you say, a polyphonic book where all these voices are chiming in to tell a story. But I felt like I can't write this book like Election. It felt like the wrong thing to do, until I realized that Tracy was in this high school and that it was, in a sense, very much emerging from Election, and then realized, oh, it's kind of a sequel, though I don't love that word. It's a standalone novel that has Tracy in it, but at a very different time in her life. Like, you could read Tracy Flick Can't Win without having read Election. I think it'll be fine. But, in Election, Mr. M asked this football player, Paul, to run because he thinks Paul would be the candidate to beat Tracy, because as a sort of likable football hero, he'll have support across the board in school that Tracy wouldn't have. And so for Tracy to look at Vito and say, oh, this guy again, and to see that the school is still honoring him. And, Vito is not somebody you might want to honor. And even Vito's pretty clear about that. He's made a mess of his life, and he's done a lot of terrible things. And part of the story of this book is Vito's past catching up to him.
Well, it's hard to be as innocent about football glorification as one was back when Election first came out, and about many other things besides. So this book wrestles with all of those things, and through one of those lenses is the experience of Tracy Flick. The book, again, is Tracy Flick Can't Win. Tom Perrotta, thanks so much for being here to talk about it.
Thanks so much, John. I really enjoyed it.
Anne Leary joins us now. Her new and fourth novel, The Foundling, tells a riveting story set about a century ago, and it was inspired by a real-life story that's just as riveting. She's here to talk about them both. Anne, nice to meet you.
Oh, nice to meet you too, John. And thank you so much for having me on this morning.
Of course. So, like a lot of people, you, in recent years, have been looking into your family's genealogy online. Tell me a little bit about that and about how that inspired the first germs of this story.
A little over a decade ago, I kind of joined the national craze of genealogy research, and I joined Ancestry.com. And I had a few questions, but one was that I knew my maternal grandmother was an orphan, and I never knew why. I never knew what happened to her parents. I still don't know the answer to that, but what I found out kind of distracted me from everything else, because there was no record that I could find of my grandmother's birth certificate or the orphanage where she was raised. I found her in a 1930 census at age 17, working as a stenographer for a place in central Pennsylvania called the Laurelton State Village for Feeble-Minded Women of Childbearing Age. One of the longest names.
Yeah, it really rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, I was a little bit taken aback by the word feeble-minded. I thought that was quite offensive for obviously a government institution for people that I assumed had intellectual disabilities, I soon learned that feeble-minded, as well as the words idiot, imbecile, and moron, were medical or clinical terms in those days that described varying degrees of intellectual disabilities. What I learned was the more offensive part of the name of the place was the of childbearing age part, because where my grandmother worked was a eugenics asylum, one of many in this country in the early 20th century. And I then spent many years researching and writing this book.
And so tell us in a bare bones kind of way, and then we'll get further into it as we talk about some of the history as well, the plot of the book and what I guess you would consider the two main characters and how they intersect.
As I said, it's loosely based on what I learned about my grandmother. It's about two women who were raised in the same orphan asylum, as they called them in those days, and meet again 20 years later at a different kind of asylum, a eugenics asylum with a similar name to the one where my grandmother worked. It was for feeble-minded women of childbearing age. But they're no longer roommates. Mary, the narrator, is the secretary to the very charismatic female doctor who runs the place and who founded it. And Lillian is an inmate who is being confined against her will. When you are sent to one of these asylums, or when you were sent, you weren't usually sent by a judge, but whoever diagnosed you as feeble-minded, your husband, a local doctor, once you had that diagnosis, you were sent there until you reached menopause. Lillian was 20. She would not be released for decades. So that's kind of how we start into the book. So those are two of the main characters. But for me, the character who caught my imagination and made me want to write this book was the character in the book who's Dr. Vogel, who really was based on the doctor who ran the asylum where my grandmother worked. She was a female psychiatrist. She earned her medical degree in 1899, which was a time when not many women even went to college. At first glance, I was in awe of her. She had been a suffragist, an outspoken suffragist. She was very politically active. And I believed at first, because it took a little investigating to find out really what was this place all about, but I really believed she had devoted her life to helping very vulnerable women. I then found out really why this institution was founded, the conditions the women who were confined there lived in, and it was kind of like a labor camp.
So who founded these institutions? The state did, and then I have approximately 60 questions that I'll try to get to in something like an order. So who founded these institutions? And then you said that sometimes husbands had women put there, but if they were children, was it often children without parents? Did parents sometimes put their children there?
I guess we have to talk for a minute about the eugenics movement of the early 20th century. I'd heard the word eugenics. I knew very little about it, and I still meet people all the time who are very well educated that have never heard of eugenics. So if you want to learn it without doing too much reading, PBS did a wonderful episode of The American Experience, which you can stream, and it's called The Eugenics Crusade, and they really do a wonderful job of explaining it. Though most of us don't know much about the eugenics movement, in the 1920s, eugenics was a household word. There were better baby contests. There were scholars, very influential writers. Many people embraced eugenics. Eugenics is basically social Darwinism. It was very easy for people to wrap their minds around. The idea was to have people who are healthy and smart, and especially white, have more children, and have people who are quote unquote feeble-minded or have other disabilities, but often it did have to do with your ethnicity.
It was also sometimes a moral label.
Very much so. One of the pioneers of American eugenics, Henry Goddard, coined the term moron. That wasn't a word used before the late 19th century, and moron really meant morally defective. And it was so the three categories of feeble-mindedness, at the bottom was idiot, and that was a very severely intellectually disabled individual. Imbecile was kind of moderately feeble-minded, and then moron, they added this because it was a person who was just a little bit feeble-minded, but basically they had what they called morally defective brains. And in those days, again, eugenics scientists believed that all criminals were by nature feeble-minded. And so they were able to therefore assign the diagnosis of feeble-minded to basically anyone. I found a study that was published by a doctor who worked in the asylum where my grandmother worked. It was published in 1924, and she listed the many traits of a feeble-minded woman, and among them was actively seeking sex. She basically described me in college and all of my friends. It was stuff, drinking, boisterousness.
So if you were a 12 or 13-year-old back then, who was putting you in these places?
So a 12 or 13-year-old might be there because she said that her uncle, who is a prominent member of her community, was touching her inappropriately. She might have been considered feeble-minded for making that up, or he might have just said she was feeble-minded, had her sent there. Don't forget, it was all about fertility. So there was nobody younger than 12. It was once you started menstruating. There were children's asylums for the feeble-minded too. If you were at a children's asylum, once you reach reproductive age, you might be sent to one of the places for women. It wasn't a place you went to get training or to get therapy. It was a warehouse to keep you from having sex and producing more feeble-minded people. Basically, all of social ills were considered to be related to genetic flaws in the individual that they'd inherited from their parents and would certainly pass on to their children.
So the idea was that they would stay here and not have children in their own and pass on their genes. Now, you said earlier that the idea was that they would be released when they reached menopause.
Right.
Were they released, and what the heck would happen then, having spent their whole lives in these places?
Yes. Well, that was a problem. Often they'd be released and their parents were no longer alive. There was no plan for that. I think one of the reasons we don't know a lot about how widespread and popular eugenics was many people know that Hitler was very much inspired by the American eugenics movement and credited some of our eugenics leaders in Mein Kampf, his book. So after World War II, when we saw what the final solution of eugenics was, our movement kind of came to a screeching halt. Certain eugenics practices still exist today, but these specific asylums that were created for eugenics purposes, the one where my grandmother worked, for example, they became true training schools for people with true intellectual disabilities. The place where my grandmother worked closed in the 1990s, and I've met people who worked there later.
Was it scandalous when they were formed? How much of this was an open secret, or how much of it was just open and people accepted it?
No, it wasn't scandalous. It wasn't a secret. Early readers really reacted to this. They were quite angry at Mary, the main character who's named after my grandmother, who goes to work there, for being naive and not knowing that it was a eugenics asylum. The character wasn't naive. Eugenics was embraced. Everyone kind of knows Margaret Sanger was tied to the eugenics movement, but they may not know that Theodore Roosevelt, Virginia Woolf, H.G. Wells, Alexander Graham Bell, I could go on and on. Calvin Coolidge signed the Immigration Act of 1924 into law, and that was a eugenics law. It was barring entrance to this country from basically anyone who didn't look like Calvin Coolidge. It was to keep non-white people, to stop them from coming. I get why people don't understand that today, but my grandmother and the character in this book was raised in an orphanage. She didn't finish high school. She received vocational training as a secretary, and she would have considered herself extremely lucky to get this job. It paid well. It had housing. As a single woman with no family, she was very vulnerable because if she didn't have a job, she'd be considered a vagrant. That was illegal, and she could easily be herself an inmate in a place like this.
And these places were run by the state. Was there any church involvement? I'm wondering about the potential parallel to Magdalen Laundries, the famous institutions in Ireland that were run by the Catholic Church.
Yes, it reminded me very much. The women worked very hard. It was not tied to any religious organization. It was a publicly funded, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania paid for this asylum. And I think maybe people gave donations, but it was actually quite self-sufficient. And the real doctor who ran the place was named Dr. Mary Wolfe. And she got a lot of attention for that because she had only women in her asylum. And in those days, all asylums, not just prisons with their chain gangs, but all asylums felt that the inmates owed the state for the cost of keeping them there. And she proved that women could do as much work to maintain the asylum as men could. These women cleared acres of forest land. They worked in the crop fields, maintaining livestock. Indoors, they did laundry for the hundreds of residents. There were very few paid employees. Most of the people who worked there were actually people who were prisoners there. So not only did they work hard in the asylum, some were sent out to work as servants in homes of prominent families in the community, and also to work in local industries like mills. Their salaries were paid to the asylum, not to the individuals, because again, the girls who were locked up there, they called them girls even if they were 40. The women who were locked up there against their will owed the state for keeping them there. So all of it was kind of mind-blowing as I was researching it.
Well, this might be too obvious a question, forgive me, but you obviously did a tremendous amount of research for this book. And did you ever consider writing it as something other than a novel? And when you did decide to write it as a novel, how did it feel different from previous books, given the amount of research that undergirded it?
I was going to write a journey of discovery, of finding this out. But there's so much available now online. I was reading all these newspaper archives about these places and about this time, speeches that the real doctor gave. And of course, the census records that showed, sadly, a girl who was admitted at 14 was there 10 years later at 24, at 34. It really was heartbreaking. But a certain type of, I'm going to say inmate and throughout, idiot, imbecile. These were the words used at the time. There was an author's note at the beginning. I decided to use the authentic language at the time. I know these are hard words to hear, but there were certain inmates and they kind of jumped out at me, and they formed the character of Lillian, who was the one who was the inmate in my story. And then also the Dr. Wolf character. I wanted to write about her, but I really wanted a story. And so I could write about the widespread practice of eugenics, but I would have to kind of stick it to the place where my grandmother worked. And what I did in my novel was read about many other asylums, because there were many others. And I was able to make a fictitious place where I used things that I'd learned from the various different institutions that I had learned about. I'm glad I wrote it as a novel. I've always loved the 1920s as an era. I've always thought of it as a kind of a decadent time, a time of a loosening of sexual mores. And I always associated women of that time with Zelda Fitzgerald, or Daisy Buchanan. There were those women. They were the rich women of the 1920s. And what I learned in my research was if you were rich and you drank or had lovers outside of marriage or went to speakeasies with the gang, you might be considered wonderfully fun and eccentric. If you were a poor woman who was engaged in exactly the same behaviors, you were a menace to society. And I really wanted to show that you get to see people doing the 1920s things, jazz, speakeasies, but also showing what the less fortunate, how vulnerable they were, especially women.
Well, as I figured would happen, we've ended up talking very much about the story behind the book, but I want to emphasize to listeners that this is very much a novel with the usual joys you find in a novel. A lot of great characterization, a story very well told, but the story behind it obviously very interesting in its own right. And the new book, again, is The Foundling. And Leary, thanks so much for being here to talk about it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Alexandra Alter is here with news from the literary world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hi, John.
There's a new literary app in the world. What's up with it?
There have been multiple attempts by different tech companies, different entertainment companies to solve what people refer to as the online discovery problem in publishing. This has been a problem really since the dawn of online shopping, but it's gotten much more pronounced as more book buyers have migrated online. Essentially, publishers and authors have always relied on physical retail as a way of enticing people to try new authors, like a big display in a Barnes & Noble or some passionate independent bookseller is often the way that people hear about new books and authors. And online, they tend to gravitate to what they already know they want or what everyone else is already reading, and they see it prominently displayed on the bestseller list. So the new app that I and my colleague Liz Harris wrote about this week is called Tertulia. It is the latest entry into this increasingly crowded little niche of apps that are trying to drive people towards books and sometimes using novel ways like personalization. You fill out a survey, identify some of your favorite authors, maybe identify some of your favorite subjects. But what caught my eye about Tertulia, one thing that made it stand out was this approach that they're taking where they're trying to harness online conversations about books. So through whatever algorithmic magic they've concocted, they sift through podcasts, book reviews, Twitter posts, other forms of people expressing opinions about books, and distill those and will produce a list of recommendations for your individual. They also have broader lists where they will suggest books that are being discussed widely. And so the metric that they're using is not necessarily sales, but rather buzz, if you will, although I'm not fond of that word.
While I go and download this app, let me simultaneously play devil's advocate a little bit here. You note in the piece that there are 3.2 million titles that BookScan tracks every year. BookScan is the big sales tracker for the industry, and that fewer than 1% of those books sold more than 5,000 copies last year. So with 3.2 million books out there, is an app the solution, or are there just too many books being published?
This is a great question. And actually, I think one that I'll be exploring in the future, because there has been a huge jump in the number of sheer volume of titles that are produced. Then you add on online retail, and all of those books are essentially accessible with print on demand. So I think Ingram Content Group, which is the largest distributor in the country, has 15 million titles in its catalog. A lot of those are self-published. Some of those will sell like 1 or 2 copies a year. But it's a vast amount of books and more than ever. And so that's one of the reasons why fewer than 1% of them sold more than 5,000 copies last year.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me because 1% of that number is still actually a pretty big number of books that are selling decently.
Selling decently, that's right.
In your piece, the chief executive of Tertulia, this app, mentions that there's Netflix for movies and Spotify for music, and that there hasn't been something like this for books. I guess another thing to track over time is that, at least in my experience, Spotify, there are ways that they introduce you to a lot of things you may not have heard of before. I mean, they do tend to sound like the things you're listening to, but at least you haven't heard of them. Whereas Netflix, I think, at least in my personal experience, and I use it a lot, is not something where you go deep. You just see some of the same things recycled over and over again.
You know, this is an interesting problem that I think they're going to be tweaking as more people start using the app, which is you have to strike the right balance of showing people stuff that they're going to be interested in based on what they already like, and then trying to introduce them to new things. Because otherwise, why download the app and take the survey and go through all the trouble if they're simply going to show you the authors that you're already following and the books that you already like and the subjects that you're already interested in. So the founders did say, we want to take people outside of their filter bubbles because that's the whole point of this. And they want to surface titles and authors who aren't already on the bestseller list. And so that's the challenge, really. And especially if the metric that they're using is what's generating discussion. One industry expert that we spoke to, Kristen McLean, who is at NPD Books, said, this is not a problem for readers. Readers don't wander around, in the desert saying, like, what should I read? Give me a new book. I mean, some of us do, but for the most part, this is an industry problem. It's a problem for publishers who have seen their traditional marketing methods crumble in the face of everyone moving online. So this is a problem for authors and agents and publishers. And for the most part, readers still have pretty good ways of finding a book that they love.
Well, but for readers who want a new way to find books they love, the app is Tertulia, spelled Tertulia, and it launched this week. Alexandra, thanks for talking about it.
Thanks for having me.
My colleagues Greg Cowles and Liz Harris join us now to talk about what they've been reading recently. Hello, you two.
Hi, John.
Hi, John.
Liz, you normally join us for the news segment on the show, but I thought it would be fun to have you on to hear what you've been reading in your spare time. So why don't you go first?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm delighted to chat about it. I am reading Frank Sonnets by Diane Seuss, which just won the Pulitzer. And on Pulitzer Day, we cover the Pulitzers here, obviously. And my job was to write up the poetry winner and finalists. And at the time, I hadn't read Frank Sonnets yet. So I was frantically reading about it as quickly as I could and reading as many stories as I could and as many reviews as I could. And then Greg sent me the PDF of the collection and I read a bunch of poems. Thank you, Greg. And I was just like, oh my God, I have to read the rest of this. And so the moment I filed while I was being edited, probably by you, John, I ordered the collection immediately. And the book is a memoir in sonnet form. There are poems about abortion and about giving birth. There are quite a few poems about addiction, her childhood, and the death of her father when she was a kid. And one thing that's really interesting about structurally what she does here is it's all sonnets. So they're all 14 lines. And the form is such that all these things she writes about occupy roughly the same amount of space. So whether it's a small moment from her childhood she's remembering, or these like really wrenching poems about her son struggling with addiction and trying to get out from under it, they all occupy a similar amount of space on the page. And there are two poems that are a bit longer, and they do this. It's like a double wide poem. They take up the width of 2 pages, but they're still only 14 lines, and they have this little fold out in the middle. But it's an interesting exercise and discipline in the writing of it. Make things large and small take up the same form.
The fold out is very cool.
It is cool, isn't it? And I was reading it on a plane recently, and I was like, how do I do this? Like, just opened it into the guy next to me. It worked out great. And another thing that I thought was interesting about this, I was listening to her on another literary podcast called First Draft, and Seuss was talking about her process in a way that I found really interesting. And she said that she doesn't know where she's going when she starts a poem. She just has a couple of lines, and from there, it's about the discovery. And one poem toward the end of the book, she's describing being with a friend who's dying, and she's really walled herself off and is pulling away as much as she can. And her friend says something really beautiful that makes her wince. And then the next phrase is this like absolute crusher. I felt love all the way then and never since. And that line apparently grew out of the need to rhyme a word with wince, which I just thought was so incredible. So it's a really incredible, moving portrait of her life.
Greg, I don't know if you've read the entire thing. I read the first 20 or so poems and was reading them at the time the Pulitzer was announced, which felt a little weird. It's unlike me to be reading the winner of it at the time. What do you think about the collection?
I think it's incredible. I read it in galley form months before it came out and tried to assign it here. A little peek behind the curtains at the process here is I'm the poetry editor for the Sunday Book Review. I assign our poetry reviews, and I see a lot of poetry collections, and we don't generally review a lot just because there's so much that comes out and we're competing for space with all the other forms of literature. This was one that I very much wanted to assign, and I offered it to about 3 different people, and it didn't work out for one reason or another. There were conflicts. Somebody took a look at it and kept it for a time before deciding they weren't able to do it. And so its time came and went, and the review didn't work out. But it was a book that has stuck with me enough. On the morning of Pulitzer Day, I said, what book has a strong chance of winning this one? I predict it's going to be this book. And John, you said, I'm reading it right now. The rare poetry book that all 3 of us on this podcast have read and enjoyed. So I was very happy to see it win, and very sorry not to have a review in our pages.
Yes, but I think your prediction is immortalized somewhere in a Slack channel. What have you been reading lately, Greg?
I've been reading a book. It's not poetry, but it's very poetic. It's a book we reviewed a few months ago called Life Between the Tides by a guy named Adam Nicholson. He's British or Scottish. It's a book about tide pools. Specifically, he's writing about tide pools on the Scottish coast in a bay where he and his family vacation, a bay where his wife first took him early in their marriage or early in their courtship. It's really a naturalist's look at tide pools themselves and the world that unfolds there. It's one of these real like world in a nutshell approaches. Our reviewer, Ben Goldfarb, compared it to Annie Dillard or the ecologist David Haskell. And that's a good call. Those both feel like apt comparisons. But I think you'd also have to mention Rachel Carson's The Edge of the Sea, or in a more recent vein, I would also add Robert McFarlane to the list, because as with Dillard or McFarlane, a lot of the pleasure in this book comes from his fluency and his delight in a very particular and specialized vocabulary. He goes into the etymologies of the argot of the specific kind of winkle. He tells us, for instance, that the Latin name for edible winkles translates to the shory shore things, which it just made me laugh.
It feels a little like giving up calling something that.
Yeah. He differentiates among the different kinds of seaweed he comes across, and he gives a real sense of the constant and surprising frenzy of life in the tide pools. From the outside, they look like these still, very still life images, but he paints a real picture of them as a constant struggle for survival, a competition for resources, predators, the crabs. He tells you about each of the animals that you'll find there, the winkles and the crabs and the prawn. He distinguishes prawn from shrimp, and it's beautifully written. And then he expands it in the second half. So if he gives a sense in the first half that tide pools are like a stand-in for life as a whole, for competition, the struggle for survival, that they're like little watery dioramas that represent bigger life, then he opens it up in the second half to look at that bigger life. He brings humans into the picture and looks at archaeology and anthropology and mythology along the Scottish coast. I like that part of the book less, frankly. For me, I was really enthralled by the small picture tide pool stuff and wished that he had maybe ended it there. But it's just beautifully written. I wanted to read a couple of excerpts from early on when he's still painting the picture of what you might find in a tide pool. It's funny, he's in a very charming and what felt like a very British way. He makes his own tide pools because he's fascinated by them, but can't find any at the bay where he sets out to write about them. And so he's like, well, I'm just going to make my own. But he feels bad doing that because he's altering the landscape. And so he writes to the local government for permission to like get a permit. And he's granted that permission. And as part of that, he sends them pictures of what he did. And he's hurt. His feelings are hurt when they write back very dismissively and say, yes, of course it's okay. It's like children making sandcastles. He said, no, it's more than that.
It's a part Rachel Carson, part Monty Python, it sounds like.
Yeah. So he creates these tide pools himself out of rocks. He makes these rocks capture the tide and then watches as they fill with life and take on this whole ecology that he describes. And in a discussion of the periwinkles that in the chapter on the winkle, he writes, I thought at first they were still, but watching each cluster showed that gently, at about a move a minute, they were jostling and bustling, a slow motion stirring like a stately and patient dance. It was a Dickensian scene, a social conference, in silence, but with the look, if you could have heard it, of much muttering and murmuring. I love that it calls back to something that he had in the introduction about hermit crabs as like porters on trains moving the shells about. They're in the winkle shells or the shells with little bits of seaweed growing on it. And he talks about them moving it back and forth like porters on a train. And so this description of the periwinkles moving at an inch a minute or less than that, it just felt like a callback. It's a book that I think a lot about as I walk the shores of Long Island Sound myself and see tide pools. I've always noticed them and never paid real attention to them. But now that I've read this book, I stop. I've never actually seen anything the way that he has. I think I might need to sit for hours, and I don't have the patience to do that.
Yeah, you've never described the Long Island shore as Dickensian to me anyway. So I guess you're learning.
How about you, John? What are you reading?
I'm going to read a couple of short excerpts from something very different. This segment has been tough for me recently, actually, because I've been reading so much for work, some things that I either can't or don't want to talk about until a future date. I recently started, though, just filling in a general hole in my reading life, a book by the British writer Alan Sillitoe, who I think is best known by far, here especially, but even maybe in his home country, for two books that came out in consecutive years in the late 1950s and they were both turned into movies. One is the one I'm reading, which is a novel called Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, which was made into a movie starring Albert Finney. And the other was a short story in a collection of the same title, which is a great title, called The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, that was made into a movie starring Tom Courtenay. And Saturday Night and Sunday Morning is the one I'm reading, and it starts with, as you can tell from the title maybe, it's contrasting Saturday night, which in the opening pages is called the best and bingiest glad time of the week, one of the 52 holidays in the slow-turning big wheel of the year, a violent preamble to a prostrate Sabbath, where all these factory workers and their friends and girlfriends get together and get quite intoxicated. And in this opening scene, the main character, whose name is Arthur Seaton, who works at a factory, not unlike the one Sillitoe worked at. He left school at 14 to work in a factory and became, in the 1950s, one of this generation that was called the Angry Young Men, along with the playwright John Osborne and others. The writers themselves hated that label, but that's what they were called. Writing this kind of kitchen sink realism about the working class in Britain in the post-war years. And obviously, the Sunday morning brings some grim times, but the opening pages is a kind of raucous Saturday night scene, and Arthur has gotten into a drinking competition with a loudmouth stranger who challenges him to see who can drink the most. And I think, we get the exact tally here somewhere. I believe he had 7 small gins and 11 pints of beer. That's Arthur's total. And so we learn at the end of the first paragraph that he has fallen from the topmost stair to the bottom of this bar that they're in, the pub. And so here are 2 paragraphs separated by a couple of pages. So he gets up and goes to the top of the stairs, feeling pretty confident about himself. He turned his head in a slow stare around the packed room as if he did not know which foot to move first in order to start his body on the descent, or even know why he wanted to go down the stairs at that particular moment. He felt electric light bulbs shining and burning into the back of his head, and sensed in the opening and closing flash of a second that his mind and body were entirely separate entities, inconsiderately intent on going their different ways. For some reason, the loud, cracked voice singing in the room behind seemed like a signal that he should begin descending at once. So he put 1 foot forward, watched it turn towards the next step in a hazy fashion, and felt the weight of his body bending towards it until pressure from above became so great that he started rolling down the stairs. Then he flashes back to the drinking contest that got him in this state, and then he's tumbling again, and Sillitoe writes, "He was laughing to himself as he rolled down the stairs at the dull bump going on behind his head and along his spine, as if it were happening miles away, like a vibration on another part of the Earth's surface, and he an earthquake machine on which it was faintly recorded. This rolling motion was so restful and soporific, in fact, that when he stopped traveling, having arrived at the bottom of the stairs, he kept his eyes closed and went to sleep. It was a pleasant and far-away feeling, and he wanted to stay in exactly the same position for the rest of his life." What I love about that is that another contemporary of Sillitoe's, Kingsley Amis, has, I think, one of the great hangover scenes in Lucky Jim, his novel. And this is, I think, a great pre-hangover scene. And I think there are probably many more of them in this book.
There's something very much of Kingsley Amis to the passage that you read. And I'd almost say they're not the angry young men, they're the hungover young men.
Yes. Yeah, they're too hungover to be angry. What was I angry about again? Let's list again the books you've been reading.
I read Frank Sonnets by Diane Seuss.
I read Life Between the Tides by Adam Nicholson.
And I'm reading Saturday Night and Sunday Morning by Alan Sillitoe. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.